Liberal Viewer present.
So, one way Republican spinners try to energize their conservative Christian base is to create this false division between Christian believers supposedly supporting Bush and the Republicans, and unbelievers supposedly supporting the Democrats. You can see Bill O'Reilly setting up this false dichotomy in his recent pre-election interview with President Bush here.
The secular progressives don't like you because you're a man of faith.
Yeah.
You know that.
Yes. That causes me to be sad for people who don't like somebody because he happens to believe in the Almighty.
But you know that's in play.
Absolutely.
They think you are some kind of evangelical who God tells you what to do and you go out and do it, and they hate that.
I guess that I have pity for people who believe that. They don't understand the relationship between man and the Almighty then. And
they don't believe it.
But is it really fair to try to convince people that G.W. Bush is the candidate of believing Christians? One Christian who used to work for the Bush administration's Office of Faith-Based Initiatives doesn't think so. Here's what David Kuo recently told Leslie Stahl on CBS's 60 Minutes.
This message that's been sent out to Christians for a long time now, that Jesus came primarily for a political agenda. And recently just primarily a right-wing political agenda, as if this culture war is a war for God, and it's not a war for God. It's a war for politics.
Of course, religion does have political implications. In Christianity, for example, Jesus spends much of his part of the Bible calling for compassion for the poor and underprivileged. So-called compassionate conservatism, therefore, gave a cloak of legitimacy to Bush's partisan religious message, as David Kuo explained to Comedy Central's Stephen Colbert in this clip.
He promised to raise $8 billion a year to care for the poor.
Yeah.
But we're not just going to use government institutions. We're going to use the people on the ground. We're going to use charities to really help.
What, he said he was going to raise $8 billion for, what was it, the Office of Faith-Based Initiative was going to get $8 billion?
Yeah, first speech of his campaign, amazing speech. He said, the poor's plight will be our calling. And we're going to have $8 billion a year in new funding for the poor.
How much funding did the office get?
In the first 3 years, I think less than 1% of the first year's promise. That's kind of complicated. Like $60 million over the first 3 years.
Okay, so less than 1% of the $8 billion.
Yeah, in 1 year.
Okay, but doesn't that keep the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives hungry, so they'll work harder, so they get more money?
That's exactly what we did. We've fought really hard to try to do this thing for the poor, except we found out we had to fight the White House harder than we had to fight most other people.
That's right. According to the former number 2 guy at Bush's own Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, the biggest obstacle to compassionate conservatism was the lack of real compassion at the White House. Here's David Kuo giving more details of how Bush betrayed him as a Christian in this clip from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher.
I went to the Bush White House trying to fight for poverty, figuring that that he would actually fulfill his promise for $8 billion a year in fighting for the poor. And what was disappointing, what was shocking, was that it was all talk, very little action, and no one talked about poverty. But they benefited unbelievably, politically, by just talking about compassion. Now, it's interesting, I listened to your panel, and I thought what was interesting is, in the discussion, no one actually mentioned there are 5 million more poor people in America today. There are more people hungry in America today than there were in 2001. And yet, the White House goes around touting how much it's done on compassion. And that's a facade. I think if it were any other area of public life, other than dealing with the poor, what the White House has said on compassion and not done on compassion would be one of the biggest scandals of the presidency.
It's true. In fact, the saddest thing about David Kuo's comments was that his main point, that G.W. Bush's compassionate conservatism has been all talk with no real compassion for the poor, didn't really generate any scandal or much news coverage. What got the real coverage was Kuo's comments in his book and, again to 60 Minutes, that
you write in the book that in the White House staff, people roll their eyes at the evangelicals. They call them nuts. They call them goofy. Yeah. Is that really what the attitude was?
Absolutely. You name the important Christian leader, and I have heard them mocked by serious people in serious places.
Specifically, he says, people in the White House political office referred to Pat Robertson as insane, Jerry Falwell as ridiculous, James Dobson had to be controlled. And President Bush, he writes, talked about his compassion agenda, but never really fought for it.
The President of the United States promised that he would be the leading lobbyist on behalf of the poor. What better lobbyist could anybody get?
So what do you think? Has George W. Bush been the leading lobbyist on behalf of the poor or on behalf of the privileged? And is it really fair for Bush and the Republicans to cast themselves as the party of Christian believers?
YouTube, you decide.